and we're going to create a brand new political party. It was true that the United States was not intended to have political parties at its birth when the Constitution was created. Nowhere in the Constitution are political parties even mentioned. But during the administration of President Washington, as you know, political parties emerged as the two sides could not agree really on anything. And the two sides that emerged initially were the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Over time, it took about 40 years, but the Federalist Party kind of dies out. And eventually it's just everybody becomes a Democratic Republican, and then eventually with Andrew Jackson, just Democrats. But Andrew Jackson was such a polarizing figure that a new party emerged and basically the entire purpose of this party was to oppose Andrew Jackson and his policies. That's what they were created to do. They called themselves the Whigs. The Whigs. And they basically, this name is stolen from England. In the 1700s, there was a political party in England called the Whigs, and their platform was to just oppose anything that the king did. They were the opposition party. Therefore, this party emerges to oppose King Andrew, even though he's obviously not a king, he's president. But they saw him as a king because of his extreme likelihood to use the veto power and his hatred of the national bank. And basically anything that he did, they were in opposition to. All right. So the Whigs, some of the Whigs, in their hatred of Andrew Jackson and his executive use of power, some of the things that they were supportive of, though, it's not that just they were totally against Andrew Jackson. They wanted to support things, and some of the things they supported was like Henry Clay's American system. And those are the three aspects of that. Do you guys remember the three aspects of Henry Clay's American system? Infrastructure, protective tariff, and Bank of the United States. Okay, so good. Obviously, now it's not that Andrew Jackson's against improving infrastructure, but he's against Westerners and Southerners having to foot the bill for it, while the manufacturers don't have to. So, but that's what the Whig Party is. That's what they're all about. And so you're going to see people like Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, some very prominent Americans become members of the Whig Party. All right. So, Andrew Jackson, he serves out his 2 terms, and it's time for another presidential election in 1836. 1836 presidential election. So he steps down. It's not that he had to, but he follows the precedent set forth by President Washington and supports his vice president, Martin Van Buren. And he runs as a Democratic Republican. The Whigs, on the other hand, were completely disunited. As you might imagine, it's a brand new political party, and they had like 4 or 5 guys running for president. Well, what happens when you have that many people running? You're going to split your vote. As a result of that, Martin Van Buren wins. If the Whigs had, put all their efforts behind one of these men, most likely William Henry Harrison, they could have probably defeated Martin Van Buren. But their disunitedness at the beginning of the creation of their party was really their downfall in this election. All right? But Martin Van Buren wins, Um, he's the 8th president of the United States. He was the first president to be born under the American flag. Every other one was born before, America was America. He's the first president to be born under the American flag. Short, slender, bald, awesome sideburns though. He's from New York. An accomplished strategist and definitely in favor of the spoils system because he himself is a spoils man. That's how he got his job as vice president. He supported Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson rewards him in his second term. But he's also a statesman. He had a lot of experience in legislative life and administrative life. Above average intelligence. Pretty high character guy. But let's be honest. What do you guys know about Martin Van Buren? Not a lot. Not a lot. He had a pretty forgettable presidency, honestly. His 4 years were pretty troublesome. Like he had a lot of problems that he had to deal with in his presidency. There was a rebellion in Canada in 1837, which had some pretty ugly incidents and nearly triggered war between the United States and Great Britain again. Slavery was still a major issue, and anti-slavery agitators in the North were condemning the prospective annexation of a very large territory of land called Texas. He had to deal with that, and we're going to talk about Texas next. Not to mention that Andrew Jackson, all the things that he did with those wildcat banks and the Bank of the United States, basically he said, here you go, Martin, here's a massive searing depression that the entire country's in. You enjoy dealing with that. So he had his work cut out for him, and it was very difficult to be successful. Plus, the panic occurs during another panic occurs during his presidency. So, very difficult time for him. All right, and we'll look at what happens in the next election in 1840. But one of the main things he really had to deal with was the issue of Texas. You guys know about Texas? Okay. All right, so the Americans were totally greedy for land. Totally greedy. And we Americans definitely coveted the vast expanse of Texas. You guys know what Texas looks like on the map? It's enormous. Today it's our second largest geographical state behind Alaska. It's a vast tract of land. And the only one problem is it does not belong to the United States. It was not part of the Louisiana Territory. Whom does it belong to? Depends on yeah, you're right. Mexico or Spain, depending on when we're looking at it. So you're right. At this time, at the 1820s is where we're going. I'm going back a little bit, okay? But you're right. It was Mexico. Now or then. Let me start over. In the 1820s, okay? In the 1820s, Spanish authorities who owned the territory of Texas and Mexico wanted to populate this area because, believe it or not, Texas was really unpeopled. There was nobody there. And they wanted to populate that area. And this is all before Mexico won their independence. So this is Spanish territory, all right? So, as time goes on, Mexico eventually overthrows the Spanish, and a new regime pops up in Mexico City. And this regime was led by a military dictator named Santa Anna, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Now, He also wants to continue the population of Texas, which was now part of Mexico. Okay? So what they begin to do is advertise cheap or even free land in this territory. And the people who moved there, though, had to follow certain conditions. So a land speculator by the name of Stephen F. Austin, negotiates an agreement with this newly created Mexican government with the understanding that he would bring into the territory of Texas 300 families. 300 families. So really, thousands of people. And that these families will be from America. They will be Americans. So can you believe it? At one time, people would immigrate from America to Mexico for a chance at a better life. Now, there were some rules. These people he brings, these families, had to be Roman Catholic, and they also had to consider themselves Mexicans. They had to no longer consider themselves Americans, no longer Americans. So they had to Mexicanize themselves, and they had to be, if they were not already, they had to become Catholic. Well, when Stephen F. Austin returns to America and begins to recruit families to move, he just pretty much ignores both of those stipulations and says, hey, you guys want some cheap, awesome free land? Let's go to Texas. I got all kinds. And so Texas pioneers, largely Protestant, largely slaveholders, and largely American, began to flood into the territory of Texas with no intention of becoming Catholic, with no intention of becoming Mexican, and no intention of leaving their slaves, because Mexico did not allow slavery. So, Texan Americans began pouring into Texas. Most of them are good people, law-abiding, God-fearing people. Some of them had just wanted to, get a fresh start with some new land that was free or cheap. So, among them were adventurers like Davy Crockett. You ever heard of him? Davy Crockett. I won't sing anymore. King of the Wild Frontier. His TV show. He's a famous, Davy Crockett, famous rifleman. Jim Bowie. You ever heard of him? He's not related to David Bowie, unfortunately, right? Starman. But Jim Bowie, the presumed inventor of a very large knife called the Bowie knife. You ever heard of that? A lot of frontiersmen and hunters use it. Called the Arkansas toothpick. All right, but and another one was a kind of a latecomer, and his name was Sam Houston. Houston. Ever heard of Houston, Texas, or Austin, Texas? Yeah, that's where these names come from. But Sam Houston was a leader, a latecomer. He's from Tennessee. He was actually the former governor of the state of Tennessee, so he had some experience in public life. But he had some troubles in his personal life, and those personal troubles led him to extreme alcoholism, and a lot of people just regarded him as a big drunk, and he wanted to get a fresh start in a new land, and so that's why he moved to Texas. Okay, so these pioneer individuals came to Texas, and they were pretty rough around the edges, not easy to push around. So needless to say, there's going to be a rapidly increasing friction between these Americans who are moving to Texas and the Mexicans who had already lived there, the few that were there. because they're going to have different cultures, different religions, different languages, and they're going to clash. You can see why Santa Anna wanted these immigrants to be Catholic and to adopt Mexican culture to avoid some of those clashes, which Stephen F. Austin largely ignored. He just totally ignored those requests. So, not to mention, it was illegal to own slaves in Mexico. Slavery was not allowed. They had already emancipated their slaves. So, these people who were coming there from places like Arkansas and Mississippi and Louisiana and Alabama, they're bringing their slaves with them. They're not like, oh, I'm moving to Texas. I guess you guys are all free. They just brought them with them for labor. So, when Santa Anna, after several years of this is going on, finds out what is happening in Texas, he has Stephen F. Austin arrested and thrown into a Mexican jail in Mexico City. And in retaliation for this, he wants to try to force Mexican culture upon these Texan Americans. Okay? So he basically says, you all no longer have any rights whatsoever. And he begins to raise an army to send to Texas to enforce what he wants them to do, which is become Mexican citizens. Well, when word gets out and comes around about an army that's being raised against you because you're not adhering to their culture, and how do you think these people who have uprooted their lives and moved to Texas feel about that? You think they're going to be like, oh, it'll be okay. I'm sure it's nothing. Wait, maybe we could just talk it out. Do these sound like those types of people? No, they're ready to go. So in early 1836, the Americans who lived in Texas, we'll call them Texans, the Texans declared their independence and unfurled their flag, saying that they are their own nation, the nation of Texas. Now, these people in Texas, who are they? Who do they owe their allegiance to? These people in Texas, who do they owe their allegiance to? What country? America. They're Americans at heart. And whenever a state becomes a state, whenever a territory becomes a state, what happens to the flag? What do you add? A star. And so their flag had one star, the Lone Star State. You ever heard that nickname for Texas? Lone Star? Okay. So they themselves declare independence. They name Sam Houston as their commander-in-chief. He's the president of Texas. Kind of sounds weird, doesn't it? President of Texas. And then Sam Houston, he also has to raise a rebellion, as he has to meet into battle the dictator of Mexico, Antonio Lopez Santa Anna. And Santa Anna, with 6,000 men, pretty decent-sized army, swept into Texas. And one of the first places they were able to catch up with these Texas rebels was an old Spanish mission called the Alamo. The Alamo. The Alamo is located in southern Texas in what is today San Antonio. Have you guys ever been to San Antonio? If you go to the Alamo, this is what it looks like today here on the right. It's like surrounded by skyscrapers, but they've left the entire Alamo by itself, this old Spanish mission. But what happened was the Texans were inside of this old fort, and Santa Anna and his soldiers began a 13-day siege of the fort. Where inside, people like Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie, who were well known in life, are all slaughtered after the 13-day siege. Everybody inside is killed. And those guys were heroes in life, but they became legends in death. And rally cries went all throughout Texas and even swept into America. Remember the Alamo, those evil, heathen Mexican soldiers slaughtering those poor, defenseless Americans. It's propaganda, no doubt, but it did happen. An entire fort was completely slaughtered. And so scores of vengeful Americans picked up their rifles and rushed to the aid of their Texas relatives, friends, and compatriots. And slowly, as they begin to pour into Texas, Sam Houston's small army begins to grow. Until eventually, along the shores of the San Jacinto River, a battle takes place. This battle is called the Battle of San Jacinto because it takes place on the shores of the San Jacinto River. What had happened is Santa Anna's army had been marching in pursuit of Sam Houston's army. But, as is custom to this very day, it was the middle of the afternoon, and something that is part of Spanish culture, which had been bled over into Mexican culture, is in the afternoon you take a nap, a siesta, right? And so when Sam Houston saw that the entire army was literally taking a nap, his opponents, he attacked. And he won, capturing Santa Anna and forcing him, at gunpoint, to sign 2 treaties. I don't know how valid those treaties are going to be, but that's how it happened. So Sam Houston took full advantage of the Mexican siesta. The Texans wiped out the pursuing force and captured Santa Anna, forced him to sign 2 treaties. And by these treaties, their terms agreed to that Mexico would withdraw all troops from Texas, and Mexico would recognize the Rio Grande River as the southern border of Texas, as the boundary between Mexico and Texas, the Rio Grande, the big river, as the southern boundary of Texas. So, now Texas is evidently independent and free in their own nation. They don't want to be independent and free in their own nation. I mean, they're glad not to be part of Mexico, but what does Texas want? Texas wants that lone star to be added to the American flag. They want to join America. What's the problem with that? What's wrong with this? Is there anything wrong with it? Have we had problems with adding states in the past? Like what? That's right. How do you think Texas will want to be added? Do you think they'll want to be a free state or they'll want to be a slave state? They're going to want to be a slave state. And that's going to upset the balance of power in Congress. So, this is all stuff that Martin Van Buren is faced with. Should we add Texas, this wonderful natural resource-rich land with good, loyal, God-fearing Americans who want to be part of America? But we have to add slavery as well. So you would see an expansion of slavery into one of the largest territories in America. So, a lot of the Texans that were there were slaveholders, and admitting Texas as a state would cause an expansion of slavery. All right. So Martin Van Buren does not add Texas as a state, and Texas is actually not added as a state until the mid-1840s, 10 years after their own revolution, after the Mexican Revolution. That's our school. I don't know what that's about. Okay. All right. So Martin Van Buren serves out his one term, has lots of problems to deal with, runs for re-election, but ultimately is defeated in the election of 1840. As you can see, the Whig Party only runs one person and does not split their vote. And you can see that it's pretty much a landslide in the Electoral College. Pretty much a landslide. As William Henry Harrison defeats Martin Van Buren in the election of 1840. The Whigs, united under one candidate, and Ohio's William Henry Harrison defeat Martin Van Buren. So, what do we know about Martin Van Buren, about William Henry Harrison? Have we mentioned him in the past? Why does his campaign poster say Tippecanoe and Tyler too? It was his nickname. I wonder why they called him that. Hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe, where he killed Indians, during the War of 1812. So he is a war hero. He's a national celebrity. Known for his successes against Indians and the British at the Battle of Tippecanoe and the Battle of Thames. He's the one that was responsible for killing the Tecumseh and ending Tecumseh's Confederacy. So old Tippecanoe was chosen, even though he's not the most ablest statesman of the Whig Party. I mean, think of Henry Clay. Think of Daniel Webster. Those guys are much more capable than William Henry Harrison. Why'd they choose him, though? He is famous. What all has he done in politics? Nothing really. He's been the governor of Ohio, governor of Indiana. That's about it. He hasn't made any enemies. Think of all the enemies that Henry Clay has. Andrew Jackson probably would kill him in a duel if he could. He's got lots of enemies. Where old Tippecanoe was issueless and enemyless. Nobody really knows what he thinks. So, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. What's the Tyler too part? His vice president, John Tyler of Virginia. Pretty much an afterthought, but he was a Virginian, the largest state, and they thought it would help gather votes. Didn't work. As you can see, Harrison lost Virginia, even with John Tyler on the ballot, but it still was a thought to help get some Southern support for a Northern candidate. And it, as you can see, he did win some Southern states. So, the Whigs, eager to avoid offense, published no official platform. Vote for me. I don't know what I think. That was basically how they won. Can you imagine that? Vote for me. We have no platform. But in doing so, they don't offend anybody. Nobody's upset with them because they don't oppose them because they have no platform. And you could do that in 1840. There's no social media. There's no television. There's no radio. You can just slap people on the back and shake their hand and buy them a whiskey at the bar and they'll vote for you. You can just be nice. All right? And that's really how he went about doing it. So the campaign itself, you can see on Tyler or Harrison's campaign poster, you see a log cabin. So it's like, it was called the Log Cabin and Hard Cider campaign. So he's like, I'm just like you. I grew up and lived in a log cabin just like the most of you Americans. I'm used to that. I'm just like you. I'm a common guy. This Martin Van Buren guy is a Wall Street bureaucrat. He's an aristocrat, money guy. And actually it's opposite. William Henry Harrison was loaded. Martin Van Buren came from actually pretty modest means. So, but he painted it that way. And everywhere he went, everywhere Harrison went on his campaign, he'd have like this portable log cabin that would be set up. And he would have hard cider to be served instead of wine. He tried to say that Martin Van Buren drank the wine. We drank hard cider, like apple cider, like frontier drink. Okay, so and his campaign slogan, man, it just kind of rolls off the tongue. Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Doesn't that sound good? Tippecanoe and Tyler too. You know, so he wins. He won surprisingly, and it was a landslide, 234 to 60. So, the election of 1840 conclusively demonstrated two major changes in American politics since the era of good feelings. First is that the people actually get their way. The people. It's a triumph for the democracy. Triumph for democracy. Democracy has been something of, a myth in the day of the Federalists. You see, the second thing is like the aristocracy is losing its power. Okay, it's losing it. So, your two-party system really begins to emerge after the election of 1840. And I love this campaign slogan. Vote Whig. We're not as bad as the other guys. Well, are we great? No, but man, the other guys are really bad. Really bad. So, what a great campaign slogan for the Whig Party. All right, so, as we mentioned, the two-party system emerges out of the 1840 election. And it's durable, it's rugged, it still exists today. Okay? There were two national parties in 1840. The Whigs, and then what's this one? The Democrats. Okay, that's the party of Jackson. Jacksonian Democrats, they were all about, the individual and fiercely on the guard against privileged, wealthy people in government. Whereas the Whigs trumpeted, national harmony and, our society and the value of community. Can't we all just get along? Okay, that's kind of what they were all about. So, one side that's guarded, and the other side it's like, hey, just chill. It's going to be okay. All right? So, and as our parties are all, even today, two parties are not going to agree on much. And that's not a new idea, guys. It didn't start in 2020. It's as old as Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Okay? So, obviously the Democrats are going to cling to states' rights and federal restraint on social and economic affairs, whereas the Whigs wanted, they're Henry Clay, American system guys, internal improvements, protective tariffs, public schools, moral reforms, like prohibition of liquor. That was a Whig idea, okay? So, and eventually the abolition of slavery. Whereas, Democrats, you're going to see that more on the frontier and in the South, and so they're less likely to do that. So they're very different. They're very different in philosophy and policy, but they do kind of catch all. They catch all the things, and that's where we will stop today, and we'll talk about our poor friends, the Irish, next time.